I've walked these woods long enough to know when something is watching me, but the first time I truly felt it, I understood just how small I really am beneath the weight of the pines. My name doesn't matter anymore. Who I was before the forest turned my confidence into doubt feels like another life, back when I thought being a ranger meant I was the one keeping people safe. I used to introduce myself proudly, talk about search and rescue, about how many trails I knew, like the lines on my palms. People called me dependable, unshakable. But a dependable man doesn't wake up in a sweat every night, listening for footsteps outside his cabin. An unshakable man doesn't hesitate at the sight of shadow or silence. I'm in my late 30s, born in a small, unimportant town not far from where the Appalachian Mountains turn to endless green. I loved the outdoors since I was old enough to wander behind my father into the woods. The sharp chill of dawn in my lungs, the crisp crackle of frost under boots in the winter months, that was my sanctuary, my escape from everything that never made sense about life. The forest I protect now is dense enough to swallow the world whole. Tourists come for the vast trail system, the waterfalls hidden behind steep ridgelines, the pine groves that whisper when the wind cuts through them just right. Locals, though, they stay cautious. They keep their distance after dark. They stay out of places that look too quiet, too old. They don't ask questions when someone disappears, but they always remember the names. And they tell stories, ones they believe more than the truth on paper. Every ranger hears rumors. Devil monkeys, pale hikers who never blink, hunters dragged from their tree stands in the night. I learned early that fear makes people exaggerate. The woods can twist your senses. Branches scraping together might sound like voices. A deer might scream like a dying person. Nature can be cruel that way. But I took an oath to see through illusion, to stay practical, grounded. For years, logic protected me. The first sign that my logic was wearing thin came during a search mission late one October, the kind of cold that makes your breath look like spirits fleeing your mouth. A man from out of state had wandered off trail while photographing the leaves, or that's what his wife said through tears when she stumbled into our station just before dusk. She kept repeating that he'd call her every hour, no exceptions. He hadn't called in 5. Something was wrong. 5 rangers went out that night, myself included. We split into pairs, leaving one back at the station as command. I walked with Rory, an old-timer whose beard looked like the shag of some wild animal that had been living too long underground. He never laughed. Never slept well either. He'd been seeing things out here for years, never told the rookies, but I'd catch him muttering at the tree line sometimes like he knew what waited between the branches. We hiked to where the man was last seen, near Pine Hollow, a steep valley with thick undergrowth. Locals call it the Bowl, a place where sound sinks down and doesn't climb out again. Even in daylight, it feels wrong. At night, your flashlight beam seems to narrow, no matter how strong the batteries are. Rory was quiet, scanning the darkness. I radioed the others. No sign. 20 minutes later, I found the man's shoe prints cutting off the trail, deep in the mud like he'd been dragged. The leaves around them were unsettled, scuffed in circles. No wind, no deer, just disturbance. The prints ended abruptly at a mound of pine needles near a deadfall tree. I brushed the needles aside with a gloved hand. Claw marks. 5 deep gouges in the earth, arcing like something large had gripped the ground. I froze. Rory grunted, leaning down beside me. His voice was low and flat. "Don't follow those," I looked at him, confused. "It's all we have." He shook his head. "Tracks that end like that don't lead anywhere you want to go." Before I could argue, our radios crackled, a voice whispering, strained. "I found him. I think." A scream tore through the static, and then silence. Rory and I sprinted toward the direction of the transmission. My lungs burned, boots slipping on wet leaves. The forest seemed to warp around us, branches reaching lower than they should, as though the trees themselves were bending to listen. We reached the source, Ranger Mills's flashlight lying on the ground, still on, shaking slightly as though someone had dropped it mid-run. But Mills wasn't there. Not a trace. No prints, no snapped branches, just absence. My heart hammered so hard it felt like it would break through my ribs. Rory backed up, flashlight trembling in his hand. "We're done," he whispered. "We call it, now." I didn't argue. Something primal inside me was clawing at my ribs, begging me to leave. I radioed command. No answer. Just static. So much static it felt alive, like the forest had swallowed the signal. We headed out, and every few steps I thought I heard something behind us. Branches cracking. Slow, heavy, keeping pace. By the time we surfaced near the service road, dawn was a sliver of icy blue in the east. Command was waiting with headlights blazing. They found Mills 3 days later, alive but barely conscious. His nails were bloody down to the roots like he'd been trying to claw something off him. He didn't speak for weeks, and when he did, the words were a broken thread. Eyes. Too close, face not right, don't go back. Medical reports chalked it up to hypothermia, shock, trauma from being lost in the cold. But I had seen men in shock before. Mills wasn't lost. He was hunted. When his wife brought newspapers to comfort him, he screamed if they had pictures of animals with eyes visible, even birds, even dogs. He couldn't look into any eyes, even his reflection. He said eyes were like doors, and some doors shouldn't open. We never found the missing hiker. Not a shred of clothing, no bones. The investigation faded, filed under accidents and mishaps, things people could accept, but I felt the truth lingering every time I patrolled near Pine Hollow. The bowl waited, breathing quietly in its secluded dark. And whatever was down there hadn't finished. I told myself fear makes the mind invent monsters. I clung to that for months. Clung to radio signals, to training, to the comfort of daylight. And for a while, I convinced myself that night had been an anomaly, a crack in reality that had since sealed. But then the knocking began. I live alone in a ranger cabin deeper in the woods than most would choose. The locals refuse to build out this way. They mutter about old things that used to roam before humans claimed the land. Some say the spirits of the pines listen and learn every name spoken past sunset. The first time I heard the knock, it was just after midnight. Early spring. A sharp, deliberate rap on the dory beats, not wind, not branches, not the settling of wood. 3 knocks, each separated by a pause like someone was counting. I grabbed the flashlight, moving slow. Fear hadn't settled in yet. It was just alertness, the kind that arises when routine breaks. I opened the door, nothing but fog. The pines swayed gently, whispering like crowd murmurs after a prayer. I scanned left and right, no footprints in the damp earth, no sign of anything passing. I told myself it was an animal, a branch, a fluke. Then it happened again the next night, and the next. Always 3 knocks, always after midnight, always followed by that feeling, a cold ripple under the skin, like the air itself was getting closer. Watching, waiting. I logged the incidents because that's what rangers do, but a log couldn't explain why the knocks sometimes came from the side window instead, or from the back wall, why they circled the cabin, slow, like a predator testing the fence line. And the worst part, I started dreaming of eyes in the woods, too close, too wide, moving wrong. I could lie to myself about sounds, but eyes never lie, and I had seen them once before. I started keeping the lights on at night. Rangers aren't supposed to admit that. We're trained to be comfortable in the dark, to trust our knowledge of terrain and wildlife. But the darkness around my cabin wasn't absence of light. It was a presence, something that pressed up against the windows, that leaned close when the wind died, that seemed to know how long I stared into the black before blinking. Knock, knock, knock. It would start as soon as I turned off the radio. Every time. I mentioned it casually to Rory one morning, trying to sound amused. He didn't laugh. He just froze, coffee mug lifted halfway to his mouth. "How many knocks?" he asked. The way he said it made my stomach clench. 3. "Why?" He set the mug down without drinking. "Don't open the door anymore." "What's doing it?" He didn't answer. He just walked away, leaving me in the break room alone, gripping my thermos like a lifeline. That night, I sat awake in bed, every muscle tight, waiting. I told myself I wouldn't jump this time, wouldn't react, that I'd stay calm and analyze. That rational thought would slice through whatever shadow play was messing with me. Just after midnight, the cabin went dead silent, the kind of silence where the world seems to inhale and never exhale again. Then 3 knocks against the back wall. I flinched hard, breath punched from my lungs. The knocks came again, closer. Then again, right by the window. Something was circling, slow, measuring, unhurried. I held the flashlight tight enough to hurt my fingers. And that's when I heard it, breathing. A low, wet exhale right outside the glass. Not human. Not animal. Something in between, like a throat built for words but used to growls. I swallowed, terrified to move, terrified not to move. Then a fingertip dragged across the window. Not a claw, not a paw. A fingertip. Like someone was tracing the outline of the frame, feeling for weaknesses. I jerked the curtains shut and stumbled backward. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I didn't blink much either. The next morning, I walked the perimeter. Moist soil, dew on the grass, everything soft enough to record a print. Nothing, no sign of passage, no marks near the window. It was as though nothing had been there at all. But I knew better. My fear had a shape now, and it wasn't imagination. Days passed, sleepless days. My focus at work slipped, and the station chief called me in. "You all right? You look like you've been wrestling ghosts." I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted someone else to bear the knowledge. But Mills had spoken once, and now he barely made eye contact with anyone, staring always at the floor, trembling at the sound of wind. So I lied. Just long shifts. He nodded without believing me. "Take some nights off. Get out of that cabin. The mind plays tricks when you're too deep in the forest for too long." But the forest was my home. Leaving it felt like surrender, and fear whispers all sorts of things about what happens when you show weakness. Still, exhaustion began to take more from me than pride could protect. So I left. I slept in town for a night, at a cheap roadside inn where the air smelled of detergent and old cigarettes, the walls thin enough to hear someone's TV through them. It was cramped, uncomfortable, but safe. No knocks. I stood at the window before dawn, watching headlights slide along the empty road, feeling a pit in my stomach. Something inside me already knew what I'd find when I went back. When I pulled into the cabin clearing after sunrise, the pines stood unnaturally still. No birdsong, no cicadas, not even wind. The silence felt watching. I approached the door, dread clawing up my spine. Scratches covered the wood, massive, deep, the kind you see on trees where bears have marked territory. The grooves ran long and jagged, thicker than any animal paw could make. The metal around the doorknob was bent, warped inward, like the door had been pulled instead of pushed. Not opened, pulled. The window glass had smears on it, muddy, wide, shaped roughly like hands, except hands shouldn't have been that large, or have more than 5 fingers. I counted 6 distinct streaks from each handprint. Something had stood there, trying to get inside, and it had done it while I was away, because I dared to walk beyond its reach. That's when the calls about screams in the woods began. It was always the same. Someone walking a trail hears what they think is a person calling for help. Deeper in the trees, a voice ragged and desperate. They shout back. The voice mimics them. Word for word, tone for tone. It doesn't stop until panic forces them to run. Mills, before he transferred out of town, said once that the forest learns what you fear most. Learns your words, your footsteps, your voice. Learns how to call you back. I didn't believe him at the time. But one evening, while patrolling near Pine Hollow, I heard someone yell my name from the ravine below. My blood ran cold. Only 4 people know me well enough out here to call me by that name. None of them were scheduled near the bowl. I turned off my radio, listening hard. Leaves rustled. The voice echoed again. "Hello? I'm hurt. Please." I stepped closer to the edge, adrenaline warring with instinct. The ravine was steep, tangled in deadfall and underbrush. If someone was down there, they'd be in real trouble. I cupped my hands. "Who are you? Where are you?" Silence. A long one. Too long. Then the voice came again. Same words, same tone. "Hello? I'm hurt. Please." Identical. A recording trapped inside lungs. I backed away slowly. The voice dropped lower, closer. Now it sounded like it was just behind the nearest tree. I broke into a run. Branches slapped my arms, briars caught my clothes. The weight of the woods felt heavier with each step, like the shadows were pulling me backward. When I reached the trail again, gasping, I dared to look behind me. Nothing followed, but the trees stood too still. Later that night, sitting in the cabin with every light blazing, I couldn't shake what I'd heard. The voice had felt familiar, not just because it spoke my name. The cadence, the breath, it sounded like me. I don't know how long I sat there replaying it in my head before noticing the doorknob. It was turning, slow, deliberate clicks. Someone or something was on the other side. Testing, learning. Like it had practiced the voice until it got it right, and now it was practicing how to open the door. I raised the flashlight with shaking hands, aiming it squarely at the door. The clicks stopped, then came the breathing again. Heavy, wet. I whispered something, maybe a prayer, maybe a warning to myself, and then came the knock. Not 3 this time. 1, long, heavy. It reverberated through the cabin, through the air, through my bones. I sat frozen until the breathing faded and the forest exhaled again. When I opened the door at dawn, a single pine needle lay on the floor just inside, dark, glossy, wet, like it had been plucked from a tree with living force still in it. Something had reached into my sanctuary. I called Rory that afternoon. Asked, begged him to tell me what he knew. He came in late, smelling of cedar smoke and fear. He didn't sit. He didn't touch anything. He just stared past me toward the door. There are old things here, he murmured. Things that know our shape, not how to wear it right. They learn, slowly. I swallowed. And the knocks, that's the masking to come in. I stared at him. What happens if someone answers? He blinked once, jaw tight. Then your Astoria locals whisper. He left without another word. That night, I nailed the windows shut, but the nails had to go into wood, and I knew the wood was listening. The next days felt stretched and thin, like the world was operating on a different tempo than I was. Birds sang, sometimes. Trees swayed, mostly. But beneath those familiar rhythms lay a humming tension, a waiting that threaded every breath of forest air. I tried to report the disturbances formally, but there's no box to check for unclassified knocking entity mimicking human voices. So I logged wildlife encounters and window damage and hoped someone else would notice the patterns. They didn't. Work continued. Hikers came and went. The forest wore its daylight mask like nothing was wrong, but I could feel it under the bark, under the soil, under my skin. One morning, before sunrise, a call came over dispatch about a missing teenager, a boy, 16, who snuck out of his campsite to prove bravery to friends. His father found only his flashlight lying in the dirt, still on, beam pointed toward the tree line as if someone had dropped it mid-step. I responded alongside a young ranger named Elena, new to the job, hair tucked neatly under her cap, courage untested. She had the optimism of someone who still believed danger had rules. We tracked the boy's footprints for half a mile until the trail abruptly ended at a cluster of pines that stood unnaturally spaced, equidistant like fence posts marking forbidden ground. The soil around them had no prints, no crushed needles. He didn't just vanish, Elena insisted, but it looked exactly like that, like he'd been lifted. We fanned out, scanning, calling his name. That's when we heard him. Hello? Is someone there? I'm stuck. Elena's face brightened with relief. He's close. I grabbed her shoulder. Wait. The voice came again. Same words, same inflection. Not closer, not farther. Exactly identical to the first call. Perfectly identical. Elena frowned. A recording? No, I said too quickly. It's something else. She shook me off and called back. We're here. Where are you? Silence stretched thin until the voice responded, but this time the tone had shifted. Higher, breathier, not like a person asking for help, but like someone savoring the sound of the words. We're here. Where are you? Her eyes widened. I signaled her to fall back. Together we retreated to the main path, slow and steady, like prey backing away from a predator that hasn't pounced yet. When we reached the trail, Elena grabbed her radio with shaking hands. Search halted. No signs. Returning to command. I didn't blame her. For the first time since starting this job, she didn't look like she believed the forest was just trees and wildlife anymore. The boy was found 2 days later, sitting upright against a tree, breathing shallow, eyes wide and wrong. He didn't speak. He didn't blink normally. His lids would close one eye at a time, like the signal was firing through unfamiliar muscles. The medical team rushed him away. As they lifted him into the ambulance, he locked eyes with me, pupils dilated to black. His lips didn't move the way human lips do when forming words. They stretched too thin, as if learning shape. Then he whispered in my exact voice, "We're here." I staggered back, adrenaline surging like lightning up my spine. The doctor asked what was wrong. I shook my head, unable to form lies or truth. They said dehydration and stress explained everything. They said his brain was confused after being lost. But he wasn't lost. He had been learning, and now something that wore his shape had learned me. That night, I barricaded the cabin door. Not with simple locks, but furniture, storage bins, anything heavy enough to buy me seconds. My breathing was too loud, my heartbeat was too easy to track. The knocking didn't come. Instead, something worse did. The phone rang. It was the station. Caller ID showed as much. I picked up, voice breaking. "Hello?" A pause. A long, dragging inhale on the line, like someone savoring breath. Then, using Elena's voice, "Don't look outside." 3 knocks hit the window beside my head. I dropped the phone. The curtain fluttered as if something brushed it from the other side. Slow. Curious. I sat against the opposite wall, gun drawn but useless in my trembling hands. Firearm training doesn't prepare you for what can't bleed right. Minutes passed, hours maybe. Eventually the forest's night sounds returned. Crickets. A distant owl. Leaves shifting. The normal song of life. Whatever stood outside had slipped back into the chorus. When sunlight finally reached the windows, I opened the curtains. There were small handprints on the glass. Not the large ones from before. These were the boys, but the spacing between the fingers too wide, too flexible, like the hand that made them wasn't done shaping itself. I asked Elena later if she'd called me last night. She swore she hadn't. Her voice shook too much to be a lie. I requested a partner to stay at the cabin with me for a while. Request denied. They cited limited staffing, budget constraints, off-season quiet. Quiet. I laughed when they said that. A sharp, humorless sound that scared even me. Quiet isn't safety. Quiet is when predators move. The next encounter happened during a training hike with new volunteers. We were crossing a ridge where the pines thin out and the rock takes over, forming caverns below that run deeper than any survey has properly mapped. Locals say the caves are ancient, that people used to disappear into them long before anyone called this place a national forest. We were halfway along the ridge when one volunteer, a kid barely 20, froze mid-step. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I listened. Wind brushed the rocks like a whisper. Nothing unusual. "No," I said. He shook his head violently. "No, it was like someone calling from down there." He pointed to a narrow fissure in the ground. I walked carefully to its edge and knelt. Cold air drifted up from the darkness, thick with damp earth and something sour, like rot hidden beneath stone. But no voice. "We keep moving," I ordered. We marched. But the kid kept glancing back. His shoulders hunched tighter each time we passed another shadowed opening in the ground. That night, he went missing. From his tent, in front of people. No one heard a zipper. No footprints. No struggle. They found his shoes neatly placed side by side at the entrance to the tent, pointing toward the forest, as though he'd been invited to walk and politely accepted. We searched all night. At dawn, someone found a scrap of his shirt snagged on a rock near one of the cave mouths. No blood, just fabric, like the cave had taken a souvenir. Later, when the others went ahead, I lingered at the opening, staring into the black. Something breathed in there. I swear it. Slow and heavy, like lungs too big, learning the rhythm of air. I backed away. Some caves are just caves. Others are mouths. In the following weeks, reports of mimic voices intensified. People swore they'd heard loved ones or rangers calling for them from the woods. I tracked every call, followed every report until patterns emerged. The voices always came from places where the ground dipped into darkness, ravines, caves, hollowed pines struck by lightning. The forest itself seemed full of throats practicing speech, shaping calls, testing lures. The old stories finally made sense. Rory once said, "Nature can copy anything if given time." The locals' grandparents said spirits walk these pines at night, trying to learn how to walk in daylight again. The found people, the ones who returned, they were never quite themselves. Their eyes never reflected light properly. Their gait changed. That flicker behind their stare always begged a question no one dared ask. Who walked them back? The fear became a constant companion. It wasn't adrenaline anymore. It was erosion. Every day, a little more of who I was scraped away. Every night, the knocks and calls and breathing shaped what remained. Being a ranger used to mean protecting others. Now it meant surviving long enough to warn them. And I was running out of things to warn with. One late afternoon, as the sun began to fall behind the ridgeline, I stood outside the cabin looking into the trees, every instinct screaming that something had shifted. The forest had gone still again. Not quiet. Waiting. I stepped backward toward the door, and as I reached for the knob, a voice drifted from between the pines. My voice. Let me in. I didn't turn. I didn't breathe. I just pushed the door shut and slid down against it, gun shaking in my grip. The doorknob turned once. Then the whisper came again, closer. Let me in. The pines rustled like they were laughing. I didn't sleep that night. And when dawn arrived, I realized the forest had stopped knocking. It didn't need permission anymore. It was learning how to open the door. I started dreaming of the caves. Not memories. These were messages, carefully placed, vivid and tactile. I'd feel the cold stone beneath my palms, damp and pulsing like something alive. I'd smell that sour rot rising from cracks below. I'd hear whispers echoing through caverns that twisted in impossible ways. They never spoke full words, just fragments. My name, my breath. The rhythm of knocking translated into syllables, like language pressed through a throat unfamiliar with speech. I'd wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding, nails bedded so deep into my palms I'd break the skin. In the mornings I'd find dirt under my fingernails, dirt from inside. The forest wanted me somewhere specific, and I was terrified that eventually I'd go. The official missing persons numbers started rising. A hiker would vanish near dusk. A backpacker wouldn't return from a photo stop. Campers would find children walking aimlessly just outside the lantern glow, eyes fixed on the dark, whispering that someone was calling their name. People started asking questions. Locals grew restless. They came to the station with candles and photos and demands. They stood outside the gates and muttered prayers to the tree line. Some begged us to close the forest entirely. Others begged us to let them in and look for their loved ones. The chief said everything was under control. He said the disappearances were a coincidence. Coincidence. The woods don't believe in coincidence. That night, I sat at the cabin table flipping through incident reports, lit only by a flickering lamp. Each report described the same pattern, the lure into darkness, the vanishing, the eerie returns, or worse, the ones who never returned at all. I didn't hear the footsteps approach. I only noticed when the smell hit, a damp, earthy scent, warm with breath. I looked up, expecting the window view of my porch. There was a face there, not fully visible, just the eyes and upper cheekbones framed in moonlight. The glass caught a faint reflection, making the eyes glow pale. Too pale. They blinked wrong, slow and sideways, as if the muscle movements were being tested. My body locked. Fear rooted my spine. A single finger lifted on the other side of the glass. It dragged down slow, leaving a dark streak. I lunged for the curtains, yanking them shut. The house creaked like it exhaled relief. Then the phone rang again. I stared at it, throat dry. Eventually, with trembling fingers, I answered. Breathing. My breathing. Then, spoken in my voice, "You should see what it's like down here." The line went dead. Somewhere in the silence that followed, I finally admitted the truth I'd resisted. The forest didn't want to kill me. It wanted to change me. Before I could plan what to do next, a knock sounded, not gentle or testing, violent. The door jolted in its frame. I staggered back, pistol raised, heart jackhammering. The knocks hit again, harder. Wood splintered slightly. The sound was rhythmic, purposeful, a messful, a message. I called dispatch, voice shaking. There's something trying to break in my cabin. Send help. Now. Static replied, then a voice, thin, warbled, like someone speaking through water. Help now. Now. Then laughter. Not human laughter. Something mimicking the concept of laughter without understanding how emotion works. I hung up and backed toward the hallway. The walls felt narrower, the ceiling lower, the entire cabin pressing inward like the forest itself was closing a fist around me. The door frame groaned. I aimed at the knob. It turned slowly, metal scraping. A low growl bled through the cracks. Not animal, not human, something between. The door shuddered once more, and then stopped. The silence afterward was worse than the violence. I didn't move until sunlight leaked over the horizon. When I finally peeked outside, deep gouges clawed through the wood, splinters hanging like desperate fingers trying to hold on. I requested relocation to a station closer to town. The request was pending for days, caught in administrative purgatory while the forest pressed harder each night. But then something happened that forced command to take notice. A hunter, someone familiar to the Rangers, showed up at the visitor center mid-afternoon, clothes torn, bleeding from places without visible wounds. His boots were gone, his expression empty. He stared right past everyone, not seeing faces, only shapes. When medical arrived, he whispered to me, voice cracking like splintered bark. They took my voice, so they could call you. Then he collapsed. The higher-ups finally acknowledged something was wrong. They closed several trails, issued warnings, but warnings don't protect anyone from what they can't see. Not from what moves between the trees on legs not yet comfortable with walking. Rory caught me alone that evening. He looked older than he had the day before, like fear had aged him in hours. His voice dropped to a harsh whisper. They come from the caves. That's where they feed. And what are they? I asked, breath trembling. He shook his head. Not spirits, not animals, something ancient that wants to wear us. They copy until they fit. His eyes darted to the forest. Once they learn your name, you're already halfway gone. Something in his tone made me feel like I'd already crossed that line. We planned a sweep of the caves at first light, the largest search effort I'd been part of in years. 5 rangers, 2 volunteers, enough light to blind the dark. A decision born of fear and responsibility. But the forest doesn't wait for permission. That night I dreamed again, but this time I wasn't an observer. I was in the cave. My hands scraped along walls, slick with moisture. My footprints echoed beyond me, like someone else was following my steps perfectly. Every time I inhaled, the damp air tasted like soil and iron. Whispers curled around me, soft at first, then the scraping. Something enormous shifting deeper in the dark. And then the light. Eyes. Dozens, flickering like reflections of candles in deep water, not looking at me, looking through me. I woke gasping, fingers numb, blankets clawed as if I'd been trying to drag myself away. It was barely dawn, but Rory was already banging on my door. His voice cracked, frantic. They found tracks, something big, going straight to the caves. The search had come early. The forest had led us there. We moved fast, too fast. The pines thinned, revealing the ridge. The wind cut sharp, carrying the scent of cold stone. The cave mouth loomed ahead, a jagged slash in the earth, wide enough to swallow us all. Our flashlights stabbed into the dark. The beam barely penetrated. Elena took point, voice steady, though I could see her pulse hammering at her neck. Rangers, she commanded, on my mark. We go in together. A sound erupted from within, not human, not animal. A chorus of voices, overlapping, distorted, too many lungs exhaling at once. Some of them called our names, some laughed, some begged. Elena stumbled back, face pale. Rory whispered, "They're wearing the lost ones inside." We didn't enter the cave that morning. We sealed it, dragged rocks, debris, anything to barricade the mouth. Out of duty, out of terror. But sealing a mouth doesn't silence a hunger. That night, the voices found me again, not outside, inside the cabin, whispers crawling from the walls. "You should see what it's like down here." They breathed. The air thickened, the shadows deepened, and then, in a soft cadence shaped like my own voice speaking in a wrong throat, "We are almost you." I curled into the corner, pressing myself against the wood that had once felt safe. The forest had stopped knocking. It had started entering, and it was only a matter of time before daylight couldn't rescue me anymore. I stopped pretending things would get better. Fear wasn't something that visited anymore. It was something that lived here. Something that had learned my patterns, my footsteps, my hesitation. Something that now wore a fragment of me like borrowed skin. Days bled into each other. The station felt less like a workplace and more like a waiting room for the next panic. The chief put on a brave face for the press, but behind closed doors, he looked like a man running out of excuses. He talked with shaky hands, eyes always darting toward the windows as though he expected the glass to breathe. Rory tried to drink the fear away. I found him one morning sitting on the porch of the cabin I used to trust, bottle beside him, staring into the trees like every branch held a gun. "They're hungry," he whispered, "and we've been feeding them names." He wasn't wrong. Every search call, every shout into the woods, every plea for missing loved ones, it was all nourishment. The forest had learned our voices, the cadence of human desperation. It had learned how to call back. And now it wanted more. Our barricaded cave wasn't barricaded enough. I made the mistake of hiking out there alone, against orders, driven by a restless dread that wouldn't let me breathe. When I reached the ridge, I found the rocks we'd piled moved aside, subtle but unmistakable, like someone had tested their strength, like fingers had pushed outward from below. As I knelt beside the mouth of that dark wound in the earth, I heard a faint scraping from deep inside, like nails on stone. Not frantic, curious, exploring. A warm gust of air rose from the cave, carrying a sound that almost formed a breathy imitation of a word. My name. I stumbled back, heart pounding, trying to convince myself that the stone echoes were tricking me. But fear has no patience for logic. It held me by the throat the whole walk home. That night, the cabin walls trembled again. The knocks had evolved into a slow dragging, like something was tracing a circle around the outside, measuring, marking. The sound scraped deeper each rotation. 1 circle, 2, 3. I pressed my ear against the wood despite every instinct screaming no. A whisper crawled through the grain. "We know your shape." I jerked back hard enough to fall, hitting the floor. My flashlight rolled away, beam cutting wild arcs across the room as though searching for an escape. Something outside laughed again, trying to mimic the rise and fall of humor. The pitch changed mid-laugh, like the voice was adjusting knobs. Then silence. That silence was worse than the sound. The next morning, I begged the chief to let me transfer. Anywhere, even a desk job in some windowless urban office would feel safer than this. He sighed, exhausted. "Give it 1 more week. Reinforcements are coming from the state. You won't be alone out here." A week. I didn't know if I had 7 more nights left in me. He left. I stood alone in the station, palms sweaty, lungs tight. When I finally stepped outside, a gust of wind shook the pines and a dozen needles rained down onto my shoulders. Every one of them was wet, not dew wet, breath wet. I hurried to the cabin, packed a bag, extra shirts, batteries, a map, useless comforts. I tried to leave, tried to drive away from this place, but the road out seemed narrower, darker. My headlights sliced through mist thick like wool, and then the radio crackled. At first just static, then, wait, it was my voice. I shut the radio off, my hands shook, I nearly turned around, nearly surrendered to whatever waited back there. But survival is a stubborn instinct. I kept driving. 5 minutes, 10. The road stretched, twisting through pines that grew thicker with each turn. I didn't recognize this path, but I'd taken it hundreds of times. I should have recognized every bend. A shape walked along the shoulder up ahead, tall, long arms swinging at its sides, too long. I slowed, squinting through the fog. It stopped. Then it turned toward me. A face, my face, stared back. Only the eyes were wrong, too wide, too hungry. It raised one hand, palm opening slowly, fingers stretching farther than fingers should. Something inside it moved beneath the skin, like the bones were rearranging. It opened its mouth, and my voice spilled out, "You should see what it's like down here." I floored the engine. The figure blurred past, and for a heart-stopping moment, I was sure it would leap, tear the roof from the frame, drag me screaming into the trees. But the truck kept moving. I didn't stop until the woods thinned and the highway emerged. A ribbon of salvation. I didn't breathe easily until I hit town. I went straight to the sheriff's office, half mad, half shaking. I told him I was done, that I was leaving the job, leaving the woods. He stared at me with a mixture of pity and disbelief. He said to sleep, to shower, to wait until morning before making decisions. Sleep, as if that was still something I could do. Nightfall was creeping in again by the time I checked into a motel, a safe, crowded one right on the highway. My room had 2 locks and lights too bright for anything to hide. I turned on the TV. Noise helped. Lives on screen that weren't mine helped. I managed to sit on the edge of the bed, breathing slow, telling myself the forest didn't follow asphalt. But when the show cut to commercial, I heard it. Knock. Knock. On the motel door. My knees went weightless. I stood, every motion trembling. Whoever or whatever was on the other side waited. 3 knocks again, the pattern old as fear. I forced a breath into my lungs and approached, heart roaring. The peephole stared like a single accusing eye. I raised my hand to look through it. Then the knocking moved. To the window, a soft, wet dragging streaked the glass, a finger. Searching. My voice whispered from outside, "Let me in." Something slammed against the wall. The bed rattled. Shadows stretched too long beneath the door. I backed into the corner, whispering no, 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 like a prayer. The shadows stilled. Then, closer, right against the door, "We are almost you." And then, nothing. The silence that followed was absolute, not relief, a promise. I sat there all night with every light burning, waiting for the next sound. It never came. Morning finally arrived like a rescue helicopter. Blinding, loud, impossible to imagine. I packed my things and checked out before the sun fully crested the hills, leaving the keys on the counter without looking at a single soul. I've been driving ever since. Highway after highway, town after town. The further I get, the more the pines disappear from the mirror. I try not to look at the tree lines when I pass them, not even a glimpse, but they still call. Every rest stop, every dusk that creeps across the asphalt, there's a moment where the wind shifts and the scent of damp soil rises. A reminder that the forest doesn't stay behind boundaries. Sometimes late at night I hear breathing from inside the car. Slow, heavy, like something tucked beneath the back seat is learning to time its lungs with mine. Sometimes I look into the rearview mirror and my reflection is late to follow, like it's thinking about something else. And every night, I dream of eyes in caves that have learned to see daylight. I hope the stories I dragged with me die out eventually. I hope no one else learns their names. I hope the forest doesn't find anyone new to imitate. But hope is a fragile thing. And deep down, I know this. Woods don't forget the people who walk inside them. They remember your footsteps. They keep your voice. And when darkness finally calls, they will know exactly how to answer back. The night the forest called my name, I realized the pines had been watching me for far longer than I had ever watched them. I used to think I understood these woods. I thought that years of walking beneath the towering green spires of the western pines made me part of the land, a protector standing guard against wildfires, lost hikers, and foolish tourists who underestimated nature. I believed I belonged. Now, I'm not so sure these trees ever wanted me here in the first place. My name isn't important. What matters is what I've seen and what I've heard, and why I don't sleep without the lights on anymore. I'm a forest ranger stationed in one of the oldest conifer forests of the Pacific Northwest, on the border where mountainous land meets sprawling, untouched wilderness. The locals call it the Black Timberline, a place where the trees grow too close together, as if huddling for warmth against something cold that lingers between them. You won't find that name on a map. It's what people whisper over their beers at the single roadside tavern 20 miles from here, careful not to let curiosity get the better of them. The ones who work deep in the forest, loggers, survey crews, trappers, they know the stories best. They speak of things that move where footing shouldn't exist, and quiet voices that flutter through the needles when the wind is dead still. When I first arrived at the ranger station 7 years ago, I was young, proud, and a little too confident for my own good. I wasn't married, had no debts to my name, and figured I'd spend a few seasons here before gliding into a bigger job at a national park somewhere sunnier. I had no reason to fear the night. I had no reason to question whether the stories around the fire were more than warnings to keep rookies on their toes. But the first week changed everything. The station was a lonely outpost. Log cabin exterior, updated radios and dispatch systems inside, and a gravel road curling into miles upon miles of unbroken forest. Nights stretched long here. Stars lost themselves behind the dark canopy, and the silence pressed against the windows like a living thing. But I liked it. The isolation, the smell of cold soil and pine sap, the sense that the world beyond those trees didn't matter. On my fourth night, just after settling into the creaking bed in the loft of the station, I heard the first knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps against the cabin wall. Not the door, not the window, the wall. I sat up immediately. My mind reached for easy explanations. A loose branch, a falling pine cone, maybe a raccoon testing new territory. I listened for rustling, for claws against wood, for anything that would give shape to the intruder. Nothing followed, just silence. Thick, suffocating silence. I waited, telling myself not to be jumpy, but then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. Not rushed, not random, measured, intentional. I grabbed my flashlight and went down the stairs, the wood whining beneath my steps. At the door, I hesitated longer than I'd like to admit. Something about that sound felt aware. I swung it open as fast as I could, shining the beam across the clearing, expecting glowing animal eyes or at least the flutter of startled wings. But there was nothing. No wind, no shaking leaves, no scurrying creature disappearing into the brush. Just rows of silent pine trunks, standing like an army holding its breath. I stepped outside. The air felt too still, too cold for early autumn. The beam of the light trembled slightly in my hand, though I tried to blame it on adrenaline. I circled the exterior. No prints, no damage, nothing knocking loose against the wood. I even checked the trees closest to the cabin. All of them stood motionless. And so I told myself what every ranger tells themselves in the beginning. It was nothing. It was the forest settling. Don't make a story where there isn't one. I went back in and locked the door, checking it twice without knowing why. The taps never returned that night. Eventually, I slept. But the next night, something changed. I was halfway through a mug of cheap instant coffee, reviewing a map for a small trail maintenance job in the morning. The cabin's old radio murmured static on the shelf beside me. White noise comfort 10, a slow reminder that someone somewhere shared this frequency. Then the static shifted. At first, it sounded like interference, little bursts and cracks in the signal. Then the bursts formed patterns, pauses, a rhythm, not unlike the knocking from the night before. 3 quick cuts of static, pause, 3 more. Then a sentence, broken, faint, like a voice submerged underwater. Ranger, static hissed. Can you hear me? I stood up so fast the chair slid back and struck the wall. Hello? This is Ranger Post 17. Identify yourself, I answered, keeping my voice firm. Maybe a hiker with a damaged radio. Maybe one of the fire crews out of range. There were dozens of possibilities, all rational, all human. The static continued. Outside. Door. Every instinct in my body turned rigid. I didn't respond. I just stared at the front door as if my eyes alone could hold it shut. The radio sputtered one more time, a final broken whisper, and then cut out completely. I waited, frozen, listening for footsteps, breathing, anything real on the other side of those wooden planks. Nothing came. Even though I hated myself for doing it, I eventually forced my legs to move. I walked to the door and pressed my ear against it. The wood felt like ice, There was no sound but my own heartbeat, thudding too loudly inside my skull. I opened the door again, and again the forest stood empty. The night greeted me with its scent, cold bark, distant soil, the faint metallic taste in the air that shows up when something is wrong. My flashlight scanned left to right, nothing. But I swear to God, the trees were closer. Not much. Just inches. Like they had leaned in while I wasn't watching, curious about what I'd do next. The feeling of being observed settled heavy between my shoulder blades. A primal thing. A childhood thing. The instinct that tells you a nightmare hasn't ended just because you woke up. I stepped backward, not turning my back to the forest until I was fully inside again. I locked the door, triple-checked it, and I left every light in the station on until sunrise. The knocks didn't return. The radio stayed silent. But from that night on, the forest no longer felt like my home or even my responsibility. It felt like a presence, one that tolerated me, but only just. It wasn't until weeks later that I learned what locals meant when they spoke about voices in the pines. That's when the first missing person came across my desk. His name was Martin Hale, 49 years old, experienced backcountry hiker, the kind of man who thought GPS was a toy for amateurs. His sister had reported him overdue after 3 days of silence. He was last seen heading toward a region of the forest we called the Silent Stretch, a place where the trees grew so tall and thick they swallowed the sky and smothered cell signals instantly. I joined the search with 2 other rangers and a volunteer rescue dog. The dog, Luna, a white shepherd with radar ears, usually bounded ahead like she owned the world. But that morning, as we ventured deeper into that shadowed corridor of evergreens, she slowed. Tail tucked low, whimpering. I tried to brush it off. Dogs get spooked for all kinds of reasons. Elk scent. Coyotes. A trick of the wind. But she refused to step past a boundary none of us could see. Her paws dug into the dirt, nails scraping rock. Then I heard it. A distant crack, like wood splitting under a heavy load. We all stopped, listening. Another crack. Then another. A slow, rhythmic sound traveling through the tree line ahead. I raised a hand for silence. The forest around us felt wrong. Too still, too expectant. Probably just a branch fall, one of the other rangers muttered, but even his voice sounded unsure. We continued forward, leaving Luna behind to be picked up later by another team. The deeper we went, the colder the air became, a strange winter-like chill settling into early autumn ground. My breath fogged in front of me. But here was the strangest thing. It wasn't actually cold. The thermometer clipped to my vest read 58 degrees Fahrenheit, perfectly normal. My skin insisted it was closer to freezing. That kind of contradiction doesn't happen in nature, not unless nature is lying to you. And that cracking sound, it kept pace with us, always a short distance ahead, like someone snapping branches deliberately, leading us on. We found Hale's camp first. Tent still zipped, sleeping bag rolled neatly inside, food hung high and untouched. His boots were gone, but his pack and sidearm lay exactly where he might have left them had he stepped outside for just a moment. Except that moment had stretched into 3 days. I crouched, brushing my hand over the pine needles pressed into the dirt. A set of footprints, his, presumably, led away from the camp and into the darkness of the trees. But they weren't the only tracks. Beside them, a second pattern. Long, narrow, spaced strangely far apart as though the creature's legs were too long for its frame. 4 deep points pressed at the end of each impression, like toes, but not quite. More like talons. The ground was gouged where weight sank too suddenly, and the tracks weren't normal walking tracks. They were aligned in a straight line, one print in front of the next, the way a predator walks when it's stalking, the way a mountain lion places its hind paws in the exact spot its front paws had been. But these prints were too big, too heavy, too wrong. The ranger beside me snapped a photo. "Bear?" he said. "No bear walks like that," I replied. And no bear leaves claw marks that drag that deep. Our radios were quiet, too quiet. No birds, no buzzing insects. The forest was suppressing sound like it was holding its breath for something else to speak. Then we heard it, a low moan drifting through the trees. Not human, not animal. A trembling, hollow exhale, like something that had never needed to breathe before was trying it for the first time. The rangers exchanged glances. I motioned for them to follow me slowly. Every step felt like trespassing deeper into a secret we weren't meant to discover. The moaning rose and fell, echoing between trunks. I realized it wasn't coming from ahead, it was coming from everywhere, surrounding us, hunting with sound. One ranger radioed in our location. Static answered him. We followed Hale's prints until they stopped abruptly at a small clearing where sunlight should have filtered through, but didn't. The shadows overhead clung thick like black syrup, swallowing every ray. At the center was a cave entrance, narrow, jagged, only large enough for a person to squeeze sideways through. Hale's last footprint disappeared into it. The talon-like prints circled the entrance once, and then vanished, as if whatever made them had lifted off the ground and crawled onto the vertical stone. The air pouring from the opening was colder than ice, cold that felt alive, pressing against my throat like invisible fingers. My instinct screamed, "Do not go in." Every survival lesson I'd ever learned flared hot in my brain, but protocol demanded we search. People were counting on us. I turned to the others. Lights ready. No sudden movements. If you hear anything behind you, don't turn around fast. Just look first. We don't want to. A voice cut me off. Soft, desperate, coming from inside the darkness. Help. Help me. Please. We froze. The voice sounded like Hale's, strained, weak, but alive. The ranger beside me surged forward. I grabbed his arm. Hold up, I warned, barely breathing. There's something off. He shook me off. He's alive. Then squeezed sideways into the cave before I could stop him. Only seconds passed, but those seconds stretched like damp, suffocating minutes. He disappeared inside the gap. My flashlight beam caught the back of his jacket as he moved deeper. Then he vanished from view entirely. Silence. Then he screamed. A raw, unrestrained, instinctual scream, the kind you hear only when a person realizes death is already touching them. I lunged in after him. The cave walls scraped my shoulders as I fought through the tight passage. The air tasted like rust and damp ash. My flashlight flickered. My heartbeat rattled in my ribs. The scream abruptly cut off. When I reached the small chamber at the end, my light steadied, and I saw him. He lay on the ground, eyes wide in terror, chest heaving, but no blood, no wounds. Nothing holding him down, except he wouldn't move. He stared upward, throat working as if trying to speak, but silence claimed every word. I followed his gaze to the low ceiling. There were claw marks gouged into the stone, deep, fresh, dripping condensation. Something had been here, something too large to fit through the entrance unless it folded itself unnaturally to slip through cracks and shadows. But it wasn't the claw marks that unsettled me most. It was the smell. Pine. So strong it burned my sinuses, like the entire forest had been condensed into a single breath, a scent so familiar and so impossibly out of place inside a sealed cavern. I knelt, shaking, helping him sit upright. "Where's Hale? Where's Hale? What did you see?" He trembled, tears streaking mud on his face. He tried to speak again, but only managed a single whispered syllable, "Tall." The moment he said it, a sharp sound cracked through the chamber. Not a branch this time, not wood. Bone. Something snapped deep in the darkness behind us. This time it wasn't the forest holding its breath. It was us. Every instinct screamed, retreat, escape, live. So I dragged him, half crawling, half scraping our way back toward the entrance. The air grew hotter now, compressing against us, like the cave was exhaling, trying to push us out or suck us deeper. We stumbled into daylight. The other ranger, the one who'd stayed outside, stared at us with a face drained of color. "I heard more voices," he whispered, "dozens, saying his name, saying mine." The forest around us rustled, not wind but movement, as though something just stepped back into the shadows, letting us go, for now. We hauled our shaken teammate to safety. Once we reached the trailhead, he finally spoke, really spoke, voice still trembling. It was whispering from the ceiling, he said, like the cave was alive, like it was tasting us in the dark. We never found Hale. We sealed off the cave and reported unstable terrain as the cause. But I knew the truth in my bones. Something had called hail into that darkness, and when we arrived, it wasn't finished. I stopped insisting the forest was harmless after that, because clearly I was the intruder here, not the protector. It should have ended there, but it didn't. The forest wasn't done with me, not by a long shot. That was just the beginning of the voices. After the incident in the cave, I tried to convince myself that what we'd experienced was the worst the Black Timberline had to offer, that a single haunting encounter could explain away every strange moment leading up to that day. If I could box the fear into one story, maybe I could pretend I still understood the world around me. But fear doesn't like boundaries. It seeps, it spreads, and it finds the cracks you don't even know are there. Winter approached faster than usual that year. Snow threatened early. The nights stretched longer, and the forest, it grew louder in its silence. There were no birds nesting near the station anymore. The usual evening howls of coyotes faded away. Even the owls ceased their calls. Predators don't stay somewhere bigger, predators claim. One night, I was finishing paperwork, search reports, maintenance logs, when the radio on my desk clicked alive. Not static this time, not a broken whisper. It was breathing, slow, ragged, wet, like air forcing its way through a damaged throat. I reached toward the radio, frozen between curiosity and dread, my fingers hovering over the receiver. Then a soft voice dragged through the speaker, a sound scraped raw from a place that had never been meant for language. I see you. The words were wrong. Not the language, the voice itself. It carried a shape, a weight, a texture, like bark splitting, like tendons tearing. I see you in the light, it murmured. My entire body locked up. There was nothing human in that tone. It wasn't calling for help. It wasn't seeking conversation. It was studying me. I forced myself to answer. Who is this? Identify yourself. The breathing paused. Then came a sound I recognized instantly, though I desperately wished I didn't. Tap, tap, tap. 3 knocks, slow and deliberate, just like that very first night. The radio clicked dead. For several seconds, I couldn't move, couldn't think. My brain only repeated one thought in a rising panic. It remembers me. I grabbed the flashlight and weapon from the wall rack, switched on all exterior lights, and stepped out onto the cabin porch. Cold air knifed through me. The light barely pushed back the darkness. The trees drank it in like thirsty soil. Show yourself, I yelled, because courage sometimes sounds a lot like terror wearing boots. Only silence answered. Then a pine cone fell. Just one. A light thud at my feet. I looked up. Nothing. But that single pine cone, it wasn't from the trees surrounding the cabin. The species didn't match. I hadn't noticed until later, but that cone only grew miles deeper into the forest, in the oldest grove, where the trees thickened so densely that sunlight failed to breathe, meaning whatever dropped it had carried it here. Something intelligent. Something mocking. I went back inside and locked everything, and I sat there at the desk with my radio off and my hands trembling into the early hours of morning. I should have reported everything. I should have requested a transfer. But pride is a stubborn killer. I told myself stories of logic, the same way people tell themselves the wind isn't whispering their name. A week later, a local logger stumbled back into town, barefoot, clothes torn, feet bleeding, insisting he'd seen a giant, pale silhouette stalking him in the moonlight. He kept repeating one phrase through tears and blood loss. It walks between the trees. It walks like a man, but taller, so much taller. I didn't sleep that night. Months passed. I tried to stay professional, but then came the night I'll never forget. I had been called out to investigate strange noises near a closed section of trail by the old creek bed. The snowfall was fresh, a clean sheet laid across the earth, and my truck plowed silently through the white hush. At the trailhead, I stepped out and inhaled the scent of winter pines. The moon reflected off layered branches, creating a strange mirrored glow that made distance impossible to judge. Sound didn't travel right there. It flattened, warped, as though direction itself was confused. I followed the trail markers until my boots crunched into something unusual in the snow. Tracks. Fresh, human tracks. Mostly. A heel, a wide sole but spaced too far apart. Each print sunk deep, almost crushing the snow beneath to ice. A normal stride shouldn't stretch that far. I crouched and ran my glove along the edge of one footprint. It was steaming. I jerked my hand back. Heat still radiated from the crushed snow, as if the creature that stepped here carried warmth not meant for these woods. The tracks led into a gully, a shadowed dip where tall pines crowded overhead, blocking the moonlight. I followed with the radio lifted to my mouth, whispering updates out of habit, even though I knew no help would reach me in time if things went wrong. The tracks slowed near a fallen log and then stopped entirely. No turning back, no side slip, just vanished. I swung my flashlight upward without meaning to. My instincts already knew. The beam cut into the branches above, and something moved. A huge pale shape clung to the trunk, blending into the bark. A body pressed close enough to seem part of the tree itself. Its limbs stretched long. Too long, thick muscle shifting beneath skin that seemed both rough and glistening. It turned its head. Not fast, not startled, but curious. Yellowish eyes flicked open like lanterns in the dark. And then it smiled. The mouth opened wider than anything human. Teeth long, irregular, some cracked, all jagged, the kind of teeth designed for tearing meat off bone. Every nerve inside me detonated. I stumbled backward, breath catching, never looking away from those eyes. They tracked me. Every second. Every step. Then it dropped. Not like a fall. Like a controlled dive, landing on all fours with a heavy thud that shook the ground under my boots. It stood slowly, rising and rising until it towered over me. At least 10 feet tall, shoulders brushing lower branches aside. Its breath, I smelled it, pine sap and decay, a forest rot stench that clung to the air like a curse. My hand hovered over my weapon, but something rooted me in place, the knowledge that bullets wouldn't matter, that this thing didn't fear me, that it had seen me long before I'd seen it. It took one step, and the snow beneath it boiled into steam. I wanted to run. My muscles screamed to run, but my fear held me still, like an animal caught in a snare made of its own terror. Then it tilted its head and spoke. "You should not be here." The voice wasn't sound. It was pressure, words forced into my skull, a message shaped out of instinct and hunger. Then, another scent overwhelmed the forest. Blood. It wasn't mine. Somewhere deeper in the woods, something was dying. The creature's head snapped toward the smell. It sniffed once and let out a low, anticipatory rumble. Excitement, like a predator hearing dinner bells. And then, without a single noise, it sprinted, vanished so fast the branches didn't even sway in its wake. Only steam lingered where its feet had been. I collapsed. Not because I'd tripped, but because my legs weren't mine anymore. They shook uncontrollably, refusing to hold me up. I lay there, staring at the sky through shaking breaths, listening to the distant, terrible sounds of the hunt. Crunching snow, snapping bone, short, choking screams. When the forest finally went silent again, the quiet brought no peace, only the knowledge that it would return. Eventually, I got myself back to the truck and called in a code I'd hoped never to say aloud. Possible predator attack, human casualty likely. They asked what I'd seen. I lied. Bear. Even though I knew bears don't smile, bears don't speak, and bears don't walk between the pines like ghosts. I considered quitting that winter. I thought about packing up everything I owned and letting someone else inherit the fear. But something deeper than duty held me here. Maybe it was obsession. Maybe stupidity. Maybe some part of me believed I could still understand it. The thing, the voice, the forest itself. I thought the worst had passed. I was wrong. The forest wasn't done teaching me fear. It had only shown me its shape, not its purpose. The lesson came later when the voices returned, and they weren't alone. Spring thaw came late, as though the ground itself refused to warm. The snow receded reluctantly, leaving behind slick moss and soft mud that sucked at boots with hungry lips. The trees looked wrong, darker, bark swollen, needles oily with dew even at midday. And every time I walked alone, I felt the forest trying to close in around me. I still patrolled, still clocked hours, still pretended I belonged. But the truth gnawed at me. I wasn't protecting this place. I was trespassing in someone else's territory. One evening, just after the sun slipped behind the ridgeline, I heard a knock again, not on the wall this time, but against the window beside my bed. 3 taps, soft, deliberate. I stared, heartbeat thundering, too afraid even to breathe. Curtains drawn, glass trembling gently in its frame. Tap, tap, tap. Whatever stood on the other side knew exactly where I slept. After a minute of dead silence, I forced myself to move. I crossed the room and peeled aside one corner of the curtain, just enough to peer out. For a split second, I expected a face. Glowing eyes, a twisted smile pressed to the glass. Something tall crouched close, waiting for acknowledgement. But there was nothing. Only the black silhouettes of towering pines, looming closer than they should have been, like they'd taken one step toward the cabin while I slept. I dropped the curtain and backed away, every inch of my skin crawling. I didn't sleep that night. The forest wanted me awake, listening, because that's when I finally heard what the pines whisper. At first, it sounded like wind passing through branches, a low murmur. But the air was still, completely still. No wind, no rustle. And yet, voices, dozens of them, layered, as if a crowd exhaled words too quietly to decipher. I stepped toward the window again, drawn like prey to the sound. The whispering grew louder, shaping syllables from the shifting dark. Ranger, come out. Join us. They spoke with a rhythm, not chaotic, but unified. Like chanting. The cabin walls creaked, wood fibers tightening under invisible pressure. The radio on my desk clicked twice, then hummed like a throat preparing to speak. I grabbed it, but before I could transmit, a voice crawled through. Light. Hurts us. I froze. The lights. Suddenly I understood why the forest stayed beyond the glow, why the trees hovered inches from the edge but never crossed the threshold. Not yet. The voice grew more aggressive, static spitting like sparks between words. Turn off the light and see us. I slammed the radio off. The cabin groaned again. Something scraped along the outside boards, long, dragging strokes like claws testing where the wall weakened. The doorframe rattled. I stood there shaking, holding a weapon I no longer trusted. It wasn't enough to survive this place. The forest wanted me to obey. Days passed with no knocks, no voices, as though the forest rewarded my fear with temporary silence. But fear doesn't fade. It waits. Then, late one afternoon, dispatch called in a report. A father and his young daughter overdue from a day hike. The trail they'd chosen wound near that same region where the pale creature had dropped from the trees. I drove out immediately. Fog clung to the ground, thick as wool. My boots sank into the earth, each step releasing the smell of rot, a scent that didn't belong to spring. I found their tracks within minutes, the man's deep strides, the girl's light ones, but the girl's footprints veered away into the underbrush at some point. Too small, too clumsy. A child chasing curiosity, the father's tracks followed after her in a frantic rush. I called out their names. No answer. Fog dampened sound into nothing. I followed the child's prints first, quicker, fresher. They led toward a ravine with a fallen cedar bridging the gap. On the other side lay a sunken hollow of forest floor, spongy with moss so dark it looked like bruised skin. There I heard it. A whimper. Short, quick, muffled by fear. I ran, sliding down the slope, nearly twisting my ankle, and spotted the father kneeling beside his daughter, arms wrapped around her protectively. She clutched his jacket with trembling fists. Tears streaked mud down her cheeks. "What happened?" I shouted, breath burning. He didn't answer. He only stared upward, eyes wide, pupils so dilated the iris had nearly disappeared. I followed his gaze. High above, in the crook of 2 branches, something crouched. Not the pale creature this time. This one was hidden beneath bark. Its skin wasn't white. It was textured like wood, patches of moss clinging to its shoulders. It blended perfectly against the trunk, as though it had been sculpted by the tree itself. But its eyes betrayed it. 2 gleaming amber orbs that reflected fear with predatory hunger. Its fingers stretched too long, hooking into the bark like roots. Its chest expanded slowly, breathing, almost mimicking the wind that wasn't blowing. The father finally spoke, voice shredded to a rasp. It was whispering her name. The girl buried her face against him, sobbing harder. The creature's head twisted, not turned, twisted, bones cracking like splintering wood. It stared at me now, and it smiled. Again, that unnatural, toothy grin, the forest's calling card. I raised my weapon, but the father grabbed my arm. "Don't," he gasped. "The gunshot, it'll make the others come." Others, plural. Everything in me shattered into cold realization. The pale creature wasn't alone. The voices weren't echoes. The knocks weren't ghosts. There were different kinds. Different forms. The forest wasn't haunted by a single predator. It was infested with ancient shapes wearing the forest as camouflage. I kept my voice steady somehow. "We're leaving. Now." I lifted the child into my arms. She clung to my uniform, shaking uncontrollably. The father rose, but couldn't look away from the creature. We backed up the slope slowly, my boots slipping, legs trembling. The creature adjusted itself in the branches, muscles swelling under the bark-like skin, preparing to leap. I clicked on my flashlight. Its beam hit the creature square in the face. Instantly, it recoiled, arms shielding its eyes, hissing like steam from hot iron plunged into water. Its body convulsed as though light burned like flame. The father understood too. "Light," he whispered. "It hates the light." "Run," I ordered. We ran, through the fog, up the ridge. No one spoke. The girl's sobs rattled my bones but kept me alive, a reminder I wasn't alone in the terror. Behind us, branches snapped. Heavy thuds followed. The creature was chasing, wildly, crashing through bark with terrifying velocity. I radioed for backup. "Emergency. Evac needed. Now." Nothing but static replied. The father stumbled, crying out. I turned, flashlight still shining backward, and caught a glimpse of the creature bursting through the trees behind us, its bark skin peeling like cracked wood, exposing sinew underneath. I braced myself, but the beam of light kept it just far enough away. It snarled in frustration, pacing at the edges of illumination, stalking, waiting for darkness to strengthen it again. We burst into the clearing near the trailhead, just as two other rangers arrived on ATV. They saw our faces, our fear. The child clutching me like I was the last safe thing in the world. They didn't ask questions, they just got us out of there. As we pulled away, I looked back once, and I shouldn't have. The creature stood at the edge of the trees, staring straight at me, and it spoke, but not aloud. I heard it inside my head, "You cannot save them forever." Then it stepped backward into the pines and vanished like smoke. That night I sat in the dark cabin, every light blazing, and replayed the day until dawn. I saved those 2 lives, but the victory tasted like rot. The forest had revealed its rules. Light keeps them away. Darkness makes them bold. And me? I wasn't their enemy. I was their audience. They knew me, they watched me, and they wanted me to learn. That night, the voices didn't whisper. They waited, waiting for the moment the lights would fail, waiting for the dark to reclaim their ranger. I began living like a man preparing for siege. Floodlights installed on all sides of the cabin, extra batteries stacked in crates, flashlight always in hand, even when showering, even when sleeping. I no longer trusted switches. Darkness had become a boundary line, and I refused to let even a sliver of it near me. But paranoia doesn't protect you forever. It only makes you more aware of the moment the forest decides it's time. The day it came, I felt it before I saw it. A pressure in the air, a taste like metal on the tongue, a chill that wasn't a chill, more like the heat of fear draining from your body. The silence outside was thicker than usual, like the trees were lining up shoulder to shoulder, suffocating the world beyond their trunks. I stepped onto the front porch for just a second to breathe air that wasn't recycled by my own dread. The forest stared back, and then the lights clicked off. Not flickered, not dimmed, went dead. Every floodlight, every bulb inside the cabin. The darkness fell like a curtain dropping on a stage, and the show wasn't for me. I was part of it. The forest erupted. Dozens, no, hundreds of voices whispered together, surrounding the cabin. No rhythm, no pattern, just chattering fear, like every tree was mouthing hunger into the night. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door, a useless gesture. Everything in me screamed that a door meant nothing to something that walked freely between worlds of shadow and bark. I grabbed my strongest flashlight and clicked it on. Nothing. Not even a flicker. Then the scraping began. Long claws against wood, testing, tasting. The house trembled. Once, like a great weight leaned against the wall. Something enormous sighed just outside the windows, fogging the glass from the outside. I backed toward the center of the room, aiming my useless flashlight as though it mattered. The radio crackled alive, breathing first, hungry, then a voice, deeper now, layered, like multiple throats trying to form one sentence. You are ours. Glass shattered behind me. I spun, breath trapped in my chest, but the window wasn't broken by force. It buckled inward from pressure. Like something massive pressed its face against the glass, smiling. Another window cracked, then another. The cabin groaned through every beam and nail. We gave you warnings, the voices hissed. We called your name. You stayed. Claw marks tore into the door, wood splintering, pieces flying inward, something shoved, snarling, frustrated by the barrier of dead timber between us. Then, a sound from above, something walking on the roof. Heavily, slowly. Every footstep shook dust from the rafters. It was circling, choosing its entrance. I realized they wanted me alive. Not dead. Alive. Lights. I needed lights. There was a last resort, the emergency flare locker in the basement. Industrial flares used for helicopter signaling. They burned hot enough to turn snow to steam instantly. I bolted for the trapdoor to the basement. As I opened it, something crashed against the roof. A furious, animalistic roar, shaking the whole cabin. I descended into darkness. Cold, damp air crawled over my arms like breath. Even the flashlight failed to work down here, as though the dark itself swallowed electricity. My hands scrabbled blindly over crates until they hit metal. I yanked the locker open. A flare rolled out, knocking against my boot. Above me, wood split. A chunk of the ceiling caved inward, dust raining down, and through the gap stretched a long arm, fingers as wide as branches, talons curling inward. I tore the flare cap off and struck it hard. A scream erupted. Not from me. Light burst like a newborn star, flooding the basement in violent red flame. Heat licked upward, and the clawed hand recoiled instantly. Sizzling, the smell of burning bark and meat twisting into the air. The voice above screeched, not words, just rage. I grabbed 2 more flares and surged up the stairs, the burning one lighting the path like a torch. I burst through the trapdoor into chaos. Windows shattered, walls torn open, shadows writhing as though alive. Tall shapes skittered along the outer walls, some pale, some bark-skinned, all furious. I ignited the second flare and hurled it toward the door just as something rammed it again. Fire flared bright, and the creature shrieked, stumbling backward, smoke pouring off its body like peeled sap. The third flare in my grip hissed as I strained to think. I couldn't hold out forever. Light was survival, but light would run out. So I did something reckless, or maybe the only smart thing I'd done since arriving. I ran. Straight into the forest, into their kingdom. Trees loomed everywhere, towering silhouettes swallowing the night. The flare's violent red glow splashed against trunks, revealing movement on all sides, shapes slipping just outside the light's reach. I stumbled toward the only place I thought light could survive longer than a flare, the old ranger tower on the ridge. It wasn't far if I could keep running. Branches whipped my face, roots clawed my ankles, and behind me pounding footfalls. Heavy, fast, closing. I didn't dare look back, but I felt breath hot on my neck, smelled rot and pine sap, heard low snarling patience in pursuit. The flare sizzled in my hand, shrinking, dying. If it went out, I would too. The last dozen yards to the tower stretched like miles. But adrenaline cheats physics. I reached the metal ladder, scrambled up, flare clenched in my teeth, hands slippery with sweat and fear. Something grabbed my boot, jagged nails tearing fabric. I kicked wildly, screaming, and the grip slipped. I climbed higher, chest burning, ears ringing with every thud from below. At the platform, I lunged for the door. Unlocked, thank God, slamming it shut behind me. Darkness swallowed everything. I dropped the dying flare into a bucket of rags, and it ignited them violently, light bursting through the tower like a firework bloom. They screamed again, a chorus of forest-born monsters recoiling below. The tower shook from their fury. Claws scraped metal. But they did not climb. They stayed out of the light. Minutes became hours. The night stretched. I sat curled into a corner, arms wrapped tight around myself, teeth chattering, though sweat drenched my back. I waited for dawn like a man waits for his last chance. Finally, the sun rose. Light, real light, spilled across the forest. The pines stood innocent once more. Every living shadow retreated underground, under bark, into cave veins where day cannot reach. The forest pretended nothing had happened. I left the black timber line a week later. Papers filed. Resignation accepted. They called it burnout. Trauma from rescues. They told me I'd be okay after a long rest. They patted my shoulder, said I'd done good work. No one wanted to hear the truth. People don't want forests to be alive with teeth. I moved far away. Plains country. Open skies, nowhere for trees to close in. But fear doesn't care about distance. Some nights I wake to the sound of tapping, soft and patient, on the window. 3 knocks, always 3. I freeze, every time, staring at the curtain. And then I smell the pines, cold sap, wet bark, a breath of forest rot where no trees grow because they remember me. They know the shape of my fear. They know the rhythm of my heartbeat. They know how I look in the dark. The pines whisper to one another, he's still ours. I keep lights on all night, every night, because I know what waits just outside the glow. The forest is coming, not for the land I stand on, for me. And one day, the power will fail again. One day, the light will go out. One day, the voices will whisper, now he is ready. And I will hear them tapping once more to welcome me back home. Back beneath the ancient boughs, back into the hungry dark, back to the spirits of the pines, where locals still whisper my story and the trees listen.